and climate change, unexpected second. It's pretty obvious that economic inequality is in everybody's mind here today and in general. Maybe we want to move to the second question. So this one is about getting more debt in order to invest on lowering inequality. There's a trade-off between, of course, lowering inequality today and for the future generations and shifting the bill to them by increasing debt, which is unfortunately a reality for many countries in the region, especially after the pandemic. And it's pretty interesting that there's a general objection to getting debt in order to fund the investment needed to reduce inequality. So I guess the message is inequality needs to be reduced, but not by borrowing, which of course leaves the question open on how to fund the resources for the countries which don't have many. I guess we're going to touch on that too during this meeting, this session. The slippery slope is gaining, so it is a slippery slope, that's for sure. You need to pay it back, and sometimes is not easy. So I'll say absolutely not, and slippery slope are the winner here. And maybe the last one. What is the most important economic policy to ensure intergenerational equity? Increase social protection, invest in green technology, reform education systems, enhance women and youth employment. I guess we have something similar yesterday where education showed prominently, and I guess here the preference for reforms on the education system seems to be attracting more preference, and we're going to discuss about that with Dr. Filmer, who's an expert on the field. We called him for that because we knew that this would be, of course, an important theme. Okay, I guess we can start with the questions. And we want to start with Dr. El-Badawi with a general question, a setting the stage question. So the lack of opportunities and participation for some segments of the population in a MENA region, youth, women, inequalities, social protection systems which are fragmented and inefficient, the need to develop the private sector. These are all themes that we've been discussing for a long time. We, governments, of course, think tanks, academics, we at the fund, we published a book, the last of the series for the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Marrakesh last October. Our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, issued a call for action at the end of the annual meetings in Marrakesh, asking authorities in the region to redouble their efforts in addressing these gaps, in reducing these gaps. We all agree that it's an important area for reforms, essential for the stability, the macro and the social and the macro stability in the region. The Arab Spring of less than or more than a decade ago is a powerful reminder of the risks that the region run if these issues are not attended. And still, more than 10 years after the Arab Spring, I'll say with some exception, and Saudi Arabia may want to talk about that a little bit later, Dr. Abalala, progress in these fronts remain very slow. Inequality remains very much a concern. and it's very much in the top of the agenda for many governments, but progress remains slow. The question for you is why? Why do you think that's the case? We all agree on the diagnostic. We all agree it's important, and still we don't see much happening on the ground. Is it a question of capacity? Is it a question that there is really no strong political commitment to change things, to change the political economy in the region? We're going to talk about this with Professor Malik and you later on. Why do you think the progress is slow, if you agree that the progress is slow?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roberto, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank ESCOA for the opportunity to contribute to this important discussion about inequality in our region, and also to thank the IMF for supporting this initiative. I would like to actually build my contribution on a recent report, not so recent, but in 2019, the Economic Research Forum and ESCOA produced, in my opinion, a very important report on inequality in the Arab world. And that report actually came up with a fundamental conclusion. First, that actually, in terms of the social mobility, or at least capability, as evidenced in terms of the progress on narrowing inequality in the area of education and health, that's supposed to have actually contributed to the formation of social capital and human capital, especially among youth. That was a very important achievement, and some steady progress have happened since 2000. However, the other part of the story is that actually this progress in terms of the capabilities did not materialize in terms of access to labor, for example, by youth, which preempted the potential for this improved equalization of capabilities to actually lead to economic welfare in terms of access to labor and in terms of narrowing the income inequality. And one possibility could be that actually there are factors related to governance issue or to external factors that are associated with pre-distribution rather than redistribution. For example, some of the very important findings of this report is that the consumption-based Gini indicators suggest that actually there was significant improvement and narrowing of inequality. But then if you compare that with the income indicators, it became very clear that actually the consumption indicators are not moving in tandem with the income indicators of inequality. One startling statistics from Egypt is that the household income in the last 25 years in Egypt have risen by only 20%. But the economy-wide growth was about 70%. And this actually could be explained by various factors. One of them is the stagnating poverty and the squeezing or the compression of the middle class, and also the low productivity and the dominance of informality in economic activities and the labor market. For example, if we think about productivity in terms of firm level data available from the region, we see that the economic activity, especially in the manufacturing sector, is dominated by large mega firms that are mostly state-owned and then of course small, micro, with very low productivity in the informal sector. So the economies in the region are missing the so-called missing middle, the medium size, relatively sophisticated firms that could actually provide good jobs with high productivity or reasonably good productivity for those labor actually, or those labor seekers who have actually acquired better education and better health. Some of these external factors that are very important include, for example, the geographic disparities. If you see, for example, the coastal Mediterranean countries like Tunisia and Egypt, you will see that there is a significant inequality spatially. You know, the seafront provinces or regions, they are relatively more developed than those in the hinterland. Also, countries that are affected by social fractionalization along ethnic, sectarian, or whatever. And these are quite a few in our region. And you will see that there is also significant horizontal inequality that are external to the measures of redistribution that are available to governments and the public policies. Countries that are affected by wars in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, unfortunately, several countries in the Asian wing of the Arab world, for example, as well as the African part of the Arab world in North Africa. And I can just tell you one quick story from my home country, Sudan. Sudan now is experiencing the largest number of displaced and refugees in the world. And I could easily see, for example, from my vantage point here in Cairo, that those households who have the means were able actually to send their children to private universities and in Africa and in the Middle East. But those who do not have the means are languishing into a state, very desperate state, where students are not going to schools. They are actually having to struggle for livelihood. And this will create an intergenerational inequality for the future to come. So maybe to conclude, Mr. Chairman, I would say that according to this report and many other relevant studies, that actually the region is probably caught into an inequality trap, where actually the pre-distribution, the external factors are not actually kicking in the right time, so that they can actually allow capabilities to be deployed in a way that will increase and enhance economic welfare. Governments, a significant reform in governance is needed. For example, more transparency and accountability and openness, because at the end of the day, economic reform is about politics and about a national narrative that is credible and convincing. And then in terms of economic policies, in terms of reforms, perhaps these reforms that was started by way of necessity in the 2000, by the turn of the decade, they were mainly macroeconomic reforms that were not believed to be credible by the actors in the private sector. And so there is need actually for kind of a national renewal plan that goes beyond just simple economic reform, that can actually achieve structural transformation. Because structural transformation is not happening, and therefore we have many educated young people from this region who could not really find good job opportunities, and therefore they are either languishing in the state of unemployment or have to work in the informal sector with low productivity and low wages. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This is actually, we'll come back to the issue of governance, of credibility, but this is a good introduction to my next question to Professor Malik. Indeed, private sector development is one key area for reforms in the sector. We need private sector to add good quality, formal jobs, and there's a lot of action there. And you've written quite a lot on the problems that hinder the development of private sector in the region, the issues of cronyism, of clientelism, of rent-seeking, corruption, the systems of privilege and restrictions that benefit only a small number of firms, the privileged, the connected ones, the big ones, mainly SOEs. How do you change? So if this is the political economy of the region, how do you change this? How do you go from a political equilibrium characterized by all of this to one which is actually more conducive to competition, that encourage small firms to come to the existence, small firms to grow? How, especially now that there is a renewed call for the state to be active in the economy, not just in the region, of course, overall, how do you go about developing the private sector by changing this political context that you discussed a lot?
Thank you. This is a very good question. We had very interesting discussions since yesterday on inequality. And if you look at inequality in the MENA region, it actually is not too bad relative to the rest of the world. But that's what we can measure. There's a lot of unmeasured or mismeasured inequality. And inequality is ultimately also about perceptions, because whether or not people and firms believe that they are better off or not. And here I think a key aspect of inequality relates to mobility and to aspirations. That's where the private sector comes into play. Now, I've long argued that there are two aspects that are really crucial to Arab development. One is how we think about the markets. What is the role of the market? And obviously, when you think about the market, we always go back to the older discussions about the state versus the market, but it's clearly not just about the state and the market, but it's about how easy it is to form a firm, to grow, as Dr. Al-Badawi has highlighted. In the MENA region, firms tend to remain small, or they're very large and connected. Now, how do we really go out of this equilibrium? I have written a great deal on crony capitalism in the Middle East. I've talked a great deal about the way in which firms that are politically connected tend to survive, and they dominate in many countries in the region. But this is not a problem that is specific to the MENA region. In every country, you have firms that are close to those who are in political power. It all depends on which sectors these firms operate. So are they more present in manufacturing? Are they present in export-oriented sectors? So the idea that the firms are politically connected, actually, it is true for much of the world. Now, how do we really move from an equilibrium where there's high dominance of connected firms and high dominance of state-owned firms is a question about transition. And there are a lot of countries in the world where that shift towards private sector happened largely because there was really a need for it. You couldn't survive without it. This has happened mostly in countries that have had less oil revenues, right? So the dominance of oil revenues in national budgets and the national economy, in a sense, prevented many of these countries from really the urgent need to have a private sector. The other big issue besides oil is the lack of integration. This was a point raised yesterday about very weakly integrated regional markets in the MENA region. There's a huge potential for the region to be connected and for the markets to be connected. Now, I think what we see over time is that there are lots of small experiments where things are changing. So Morocco, for example, we were talking over lunch yesterday, has it has had state-owned enterprises that dominate the market. More than 100% of GDP, the assets owned by state-owned enterprises. But there's a huge variation in state-owned enterprises. You have state-owned enterprises that are very professionally run, like the one on phosphates. There are many others that are primarily a mechanism for distributing resources to key segments of the ruling coalition. So I think change is possible. You need the right elite incentives and the right external environment, greater connectivity of the markets. I think if you meet today any leader in the Arab world, they would obviously talk about private sector development. They want a strong private sector. But you want a strong private sector in ways that does not disturb the domestic political equilibrium. That is the key challenge. And that is possible because I think in a lot of countries, Vietnam, for example, emerged out of a state-owned system. Its Communist Party was very much incentivized to change things on the margins. There are still a lot of firms that depend on FDI, and there are a lot of firms that simply employ Communist Party workers. So there's a kind of dual track system. So you can have a system where you gradually move to greater private sector participation in ways that is beneficial for elites. Saudi is an interesting example. I mean, just yesterday there was a listing of a hospital, that raised billions of dollars. Now you have these new segments coming into the market. Once they become more significant and they become more important for the rulers, they will help to stabilize that transition. So ultimately, the question of private sector, the question of political connections is something that is not just specific to the MENA region, but it's an important one. And I think the other thing is about the need to gradually move away from excessive reliance on the state towards the private sector in ways that is incentive compatible, that the political elites are able to weather the costs of that transition. Because obviously, when you have a more active private sector, you have firms that are being born, they will compete with the big firms that are already established. That means you will have loss of influence. But I think there's what we call in institutional economics conversion, where you have gradual change on the margins, which converts, and repurposes institutions that existed before, and then gradually improve on the margins. But ultimately, it comes from, I think, the regional integration will be absolutely key for private sector development. There was a time when institutions like the World Bank also talked about regional integration, but when it comes to the MENA region, I think the idea of regional integration has taken a backseat. But I think it's an absolutely central question if we are to address any of the main challenges today, whether it's poverty, unemployment, female labor force participation, export orientation, private sector development, what have you. But that's a question that is, of course, has political implications, but it's also a question that has geopolitical implications, because if you have a connected region, it creates an entirely different geopolitical order. But that's a larger question I just want to leave on the table.
Thanks a lot. Clearly a fine balance to go about trying to build an incentive-compatible model of development where the private sector, the interest of the private sector of the elite kind of coincides in a way. Now let me move with Dr. Filmer to another important, maybe one of the most important area for development, which is human capital accumulation. Education was still very much on top of our minds as the Slido questions showed. Now you've done quite a lot of work on education reforms, and this is something which is obviously not easy. I mean, I am working in the fund Million Morocco, which is actually right now implementing an education reform, which is very difficult, to assess, in the sense that these reforms, if they have effects in a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. So I mean, hopefully, and I'm pretty sure they're doing the right thing, but how do you go about reforming the education system of a country like a medium, like an average medium in the region, or low-income economy. Is there any successful example that you can point as a lesson for countries in the region as they go about accumulating human capital, changing the educational reform so that, essentially to create the conditions for stronger growth, more resilient growth, more inclusive growth?
Thank you. This is working, right? Okay. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I was pleased to see on the Sligo education come out as fundamental, because to my mind, if we're talking about equity, we're talking about intergenerational equity, and education is foundational to that. It's the key to that. But let me take a step back. I mean, the World Bank puts together the Human Capital Index, the last update of which was in 2020. And as a part of that, we report on the expected years of schooling that a child born today can expect to have. But then we also make an adjustment for learning. So what we call the learning adjusted years of schooling. And I looked at some of the numbers. So for some of the countries for which we have data in the region, so Egypt, Jordan, Algeria, Kuwait, the expected years of schooling is between 11 and 12. So a child born today can expect to have in total 11 or 12 years of schooling. But once we adjust for quality, using a benchmark that high-performing countries actually achieve today, the learning-adjusted years of schooling is between 6.5 in Egypt and 8.2 in the other countries. So you see you're losing about almost half, up to a third to a half of your years of schooling are being lost because of low quality. I mean, that's tremendous loss. Of course, there are some countries in Iraq and Yemen where the expected years of schooling is below 8. So educational attainment and achievement in the physical sense remains a huge challenge. But everywhere, the quality of education is fundamental. And I'll come back to the importance of the quality in a moment. So putting that together with some other evidence coming out from one of the more recent Education Finance Watch, which is a document that the World Bank produces in collaboration with UNESCO, where they look at public spending on education across a number of countries. And what you see is that countries in the MENA region spend on average about the same, which is about $3,000 per student. And this is just looking at all students from pre-primary to tertiary. Spend about $3,000 per student, which is about the average for East Asian countries. Now, to be sure, there's a lot of variability across the countries in the MENA region. Some countries spend a lot less, some countries spend more. But just to give you there's a sense that on average, it's not the spending that's driving the issue. And let me drill down a little bit into that with some specific country examples. And I'm not picking on countries here. There's countries all around the world where you could make these kinds of statements. But in this latest Education Finance Watch, Egypt spends around $400 per student to achieve that learning adjusted years of schooling of 6.8. Turns out that Ghana spends about half that per student to achieve about the same learning adjusted years of schooling. And Vietnam spends about the same, but achieves 10 learning adjusted years of schooling. I'm using those data points to illustrate the point about the efficiency of spending is fundamental to producing quality education. So we're talking about financing, you're talking about debt in the question. Yes, every country needs to look at how much they're spending. They need to put that in contrast to what they're prioritizing over and above education. And I would argue there are few things that public spending should go to in priority before education. But everywhere, that efficiency of spending needs to be central to the calculus. And you asked about reform priorities. And I would argue that putting learning at the center of education systems is fundamental. It sounds tautological, it sounds obvious, but when we look over and over again at education systems around the world, they actually are not prioritizing learning. They are often prioritizing other things, and let me come back to that in 1 second. First, what can countries do? We heard a bit in the previous session about measurement, and I would argue that for too few countries in the region do we have learning assessment data that is timely and regular and can be compared over time. So I would say measuring learning at the various points in the education system, at the primary level, at the secondary level, is going to be key, because as we said in the previous session, what gets measured gets action. Second, we're building an evidence base about what are the key elements that produce learning. One of the foundational elements is actually students who are prepared to learn. And that starts in the pre-primary years. So actually investing in children, adequate nutrition, adequate stimulation in the very earliest years makes children who are ready to learn when they start schooling. So prepared learners is key to learning outcomes later on. Second, teachers. Teachers are central to every education system to producing learning, ensuring that teachers are well prepared, well motivated to produce learning in the classroom with pay and promotion that are linked to merit as opposed to tenure and as opposed to cronyism and corruption. So building a merit-based teaching profession is going to be a central part of it. Often we turn to technological solutions in order to produce learning in the absence of knowing what to do elsewhere. But I would argue that too often those result in failure because they don't introduce technology in support of the teaching and learning process. They produce technology that is supposed to be a substitute for teaching and learning in the classroom. And time again, we see that that does not work. The evidence points to the fact that technology is only effective when it is in support of teachers and learners in a teaching and learning exchange. And another element at the level of the schools and the classrooms is effective management, actually. This fascinating work coming actually from private sector, so work that's been done in private sector, small and medium enterprises that sort of took the methodologies that were being used there to assess management capacity in schools, and found that over and over again, the management capacity of principals, head teachers, and the like is way below that we find in small and medium enterprises, even in the informal sector. And so actually enhancing that capacity to manage schools effectively is another dimension. But I want to, just in closing, I want to take one step back from that classroom and school level and look at the system as a whole. And I would argue when we look at systems around the world, we see that there are too many forces that are involved, too many stakeholders involved in education systems that do not actually centralize learning. We look at private sector, we look at governments, we look at public sector entities, we look at unions. The range of actors who are involved have a stake in education, but actually for whom learning is not the central priority. And the key element of reforming education systems to achieve the kind of goals that you were describing is actually aligning all the actors for learning outcomes. Different countries have tried to do that in different ways, through experimentation, through opt-in reforms, going slowly, like you said. Sometimes it takes time to build the coalitions for change that will make reform successful. But no country that we have seen has managed to achieve success without actually going through that step of aligning all the actors towards education and then implementing that in the classroom.
That's very interesting. We'd like to continue the conversation maybe after at lunch, as I'm very interested in hearing about how you put together this coalition for a better learning in schools. Now, we go to Professor Waris. You have written extensively and studied and researched extensively the issue of economic development of African countries, not just the the region, the MENA region, but more in general in the African countries. You come from Kenya. How do you see the similarity and difference? Do you think the challenges faced by Arab economies and other African economies are the same? What are the main differences? And is there any hope from the main economies looking at some experience in the rest of Africa, in the African economies of countries that have managed to succeed in implementing pro-inclusive growth structural reform? Is there any lesson that can be looked at if you look at the other countries in Africa?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I was in Jordan last year, and clearly the conversations are continuing and continue to be very useful. And yesterday was fascinating. So I started working on the MDGs. We forget about them, but the MDGs were very interesting from a data perspective because you could actually pinpoint the achievements and development indicators and inequality gaps while looking at the kind of fiscal responsibility that countries had. And one of the things that I was really struck when I was looking at that particular research work was that you couldn't actually separate sub-Saharan from Northern Africa. And I think this is for me the bridge into then the MENA region. What I discovered was that countries that have mineral wealth actually don't translate into better development indicators on the ground when it comes to health or education or maternal mortality or lives of children before the age of 5 and survival. And so I started to realize that the data was showing that the money wasn't going where we would expect the money should go at an incremental level. Now, if that is the framework of Africa, including already North Africa, then when one extends that conversation to the rest of the MENA region, the question does become, is there better management of natural resources? And I think that that may be something which can be a very interesting bridge between Africa and the MENA region, is the ability to use natural resources and benefit from it financially. And I think this is a shared challenge, but I think it could be a shared success story if we have more bridging between the two spaces. But I was very struck by today's music. I hope everybody was here. And it was about peace and love, but resilience and kindness. And these are not technical terms, but these are the very real terms of what I see are the challenges facing people across the two regions. A lot of crises, multiple crises, simultaneous crises, pockets of crises, and my report to the General Assembly last year was on the polycrises facing the world. And then in this context of crises, you have people who need to survive through it, but they're also trying to thrive. And to be able to do that is, I think it's really worth recognizing, because the pressure points and the stress level is incredible, which then takes me to shared concerns. I'm not an economist, so when I look at economic stress in a country, I look for the number of poor people I see walking on a street, but I also look for the number of people with mental challenges on the road. And the reason I look for that is because those with mental challenges often are the ones who lose their health insurance quickest, they lose their jobs fastest, and they're the ones that end up homeless because they cannot handle their paperwork. And so for me, the indicators, as much as I appreciate these hard statistics, for me the indicators is how are people living on the streets, and what does that look like? And I think that those are realities and challenges that are facing the entire region. But if I look at examples, and I like to look at the positivity, I think that the world is at a point where developing countries, including the MENA region and Africa, are starting to come together in a lot of pockets of coordination, collaboration, and cooperation. And these pockets are very clear for me at a global level. So for example, Nigeria has made this presentation, a resolution to the General Assembly on the creation of a global tax body under a tax convention. I mean, it's hotly contested. I don't expect it to be a smooth process. But for me, those are the pockets of the solutions, of taking resources that have traditionally been parked in one part of the world and having us share those resources. Because when we talk about these crisis points and we talk about aid and the instability of aid, I'm constantly stuck by, and the loss of your tax revenue, which you haven't received, which if you had received as a developing country, you could make a more positive decision. You could actually invest it in what you think is more important. And so that is one pocket. Now that is being led by Nigeria and the G77, so you can already see collaboration between the spaces. If I move on to the regional conversations, then you have banks being set up at a regional level, like the BRICS Bank, for example, which is crossing many blocks. You also have the IOC growing in strength. It's now under Gambia, it was under Pakistan, and you can see the voices coming out more and more about the need to reorganize the global fiscal architecture. And this is something that I think is a crucial solution to the problems we are facing. Yesterday we heard about problems of credit rating agencies. Well, these are 4 private companies based in one country in the world today. There is no global control, regulation, or conversation that can be had around if you paid your debt, should your country have been ranked higher or lower? What I am seeing is when countries are paying off their debt, sometimes they're being ranked lower, which is surprising because it seems counterintuitive. And so this push for a global financial framework, I think, is something that is a very interesting entry point for countries across the developing world. But I want to talk about 2 Africa-specific examples that give me a lot of heart. The first is Rwanda. So Rwanda has a very deliberate program of tax literacy. And tax literacy means that they have cartoon strips, they have little brochures, they have a program where tax officials go into the villages and then explain exactly what tax collection is about. Now, the result of it is now coming full circle because they've been doing it for about 15 or 20 years. And so now you see a change in taxpayer perception. You see a change in how they are approaching issues. But also they did specific targeted education on people that were smuggling clothes across borders, like secondhand clothing. And they started to explain to them that if you didn't pay a bribe, it would actually cost less to pay your taxes. And they did the maths with them. And so they started to formalize the informal by having conversations. Now it's intense, it's a lot of work, it's a long-term game, but it is now starting to produce a lot of fruits. The second thing about Rwanda that has also struck me was the African Union had an agreement that a minimum of 15% of national budgets should be spent on healthcare. And only 5 countries on the continent did it. And what immediately showed itself during COVID was Rwanda and the 4 other countries that have achieved that particular target were actually better prepared for healthcare. So there is a value in statistics and the use of statistics to sort of guide you, but then there is a need to be very targeted at a national level to make sure that the statistic actually addresses the pressure need. So that is one regional example that I think is really useful. The second one that I thought was very useful for us today, sorry, give me a second. Let's scroll off. The second one that I thought was really interesting is 2 years ago at COP, the Egyptian government put forward a proposal, what they're calling a debtors club. And it has not gained a lot of traction, but I think it is deserving of real interest, because we have the creditors club, but we don't have a debtors club. And debt agreements continue to be private, behind closed doors. We don't get access to them. You don't know what your country is negotiating as an individual citizen. The result is that the government of the day that negotiates the debt isn't necessarily the government of the day that will then pay off the debt. And so what you have is this disconnect. And it's really important to bring in more transparency. But the other thing I discovered, which is when I was looking at issues of surcharges, is that there isn't a rhyme or a reason between which country has what type of clauses in their agreements. And so a debtors club can be really useful so that countries can talk to each other. If they're the same or similar size economy, then they should know that they will have same or similar clauses in their agreements. And this doesn't exist at all as we speak. And so that is really important. Zambia tried to bring together its creditors together, and unfortunately one private creditor blocked the entire renegotiation process. So there is a lot to be said about rethinking and reflecting on making space for a way forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah, certainly this is, there's a lot of action there, and hopefully improvements going forward. Now let me turn to Dr. Turkey. I started saying that the progress in the region in terms of reducing inequality has been disappointing, small, but there are exceptions. And Saudi Arabia is one of them. We talk a lot at the fund and in our circles about the miracle in labor force participation of women, which doubled in the space of 5 years, from 18 to 36 or something. So, but there's a lot of action in your country. Can you share some lesson that you think are coming from Saudi Arabia that can be useful for other economies in the region which kind of struggle with the same problems of inequality, gaps in participation and opportunities?
Of course. And let me start with the remarks, your opening remarks, when you mentioned the issue is not about diagnosis, because we know them, or the policy priorities, because information now is easily accessible. And I would add to that external shocks and crises. History teaches us that crisis will always be with us, and there is an interesting book called The Devil Never Sleeps. It talks about this. So we have to be prepared for crisis. So the key issue here, I think, is about how. Something that I think my colleagues talked about, Ibrahim, that the transformational changes are not happening. Why? And how we manage our resources and how we implement the needed reforms. What the obstacles are, what the enablers are. And I'm happy to be here today to share some of the key contributing factors to the success of Vision 2030. The first factor was, with the beginning of Vision 2030, was improved governance and fighting corruption. That was the first steps. Improved governance helped us to have an agile government, to make the right decisions in a timely manner, and fighting corruption paved the way for implementing our reforms effectively. And that was a very crucial factor. And number two is the comprehensive scope of Vision 2030. That was critical as well, because it created the right and optimal ecosystem to implement a wide range of reforms. It helped us to achieve alignment and synergies. And the alignment of synergies did not only help us to mobilize all resources effectively, but also paved the way for the private sector to join efforts and to align their plans with the Vision 2030 objectives. And all of that together helped us to advance our progress and the Vision 2030. And number three is the leadership commitment, the unwavering commitment to implementation of Vision 2030, even in the face of great challenges and historical crises like COVID-19. The government expressed its commitment to continue with the Vision 2030, and that was very successful. And what started in 2016, Vision 2030 I'm talking about here, as a dream, it is now a reality that everyone believes in because of the strong commitment to implementation of reforms. And that being said, I want to also emphasize that when we talk about execution plan, which is very important and very relevant to what we are talking about here, the government is fully aware of what is called in decision-making science commitment bias or irrational escalation of commitment. So the government is humble enough to revisit all the plans and to adjust, adapt where necessary to ensure that the journey continues to the ultimate objectives. And finally, I will conclude with this, the importance of how we can challenge the status quo and overcome the long-standing challenges. And in our example, we engaged young leaders to help the government challenge the status quo and come up with innovative solutions, as they always do. And our role model in this case, His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman. He's a young but historical reader whose positive impact on Saudi Arabia and beyond will be remembered for the generations to come. And we managed to make a transformational changes in Saudi Arabia as it is happening right now. So I think all of these factors combined together was the reason for Saudi Arabia to make a remarkable progress under Vision 2030.
Thanks a lot. This is, of course, the issue of governance comes back again. Our second round, I'll start with Professor Malik, and I go to another area, which is probably the area where the gap of MENA with the rest of the world is the largest. This is in our book. We have an index of inclusiveness, and we score MENA versus other regions. The area where MENA is lagging the most behind is gender gaps. Is the possibility for women to have a participation in economic life. Now, you are a political economy teacher and scholar. And one normal explanation of why the gender gaps in the region is social norms, social institutions. So the question for you is, how do you go about, again, changing the political, if you want, equilibrium? How do you go about engineering a change in social norms? Is this something that is going to go gradually over time? We don't need to worry about it. We need to wait for society to change. Or there's a room for economic policy intervention. And we all know what the economic policies are. Changing the tax regime to make it more incentive compatible for female participation, more childcare, more transportation, access to credit, changing the labor market rules to make it more easy to have participation on part-time, flexible. So we all know about the range of economic tools, economic policy tools, but we have this constant issue: is this enough, or do we need to change the social norm, and what can we do to engineer the social norm? How do you see the political equilibrium, political and economic equilibrium in this particular area of inequalities and gaps?
Thank you very much. I think as a context for listeners, the Middle East and North Africa region has one of the lowest rates of female labor force participation in the world. And that has been a persistent feature of Middle Eastern development. Now, this is a problem that cannot be analyzed in isolation. It's linked with private sector, it's linked with social norms, it links with the economic structure of societies. Let me begin by challenging the prevailing view in the literature. And I must say that we don't know enough about why the region has such a persistently low female labor force participation rates. A lot of studies have argued that this is because of social structure, norms, religious norms. And I think, while these might have some role to play, I think there are two aspects that are crucial to highlight. One is that these norms are not, if there are any such norms, they are particularly greater role of patriarchy or patrilineal norms. They don't necessarily stick for too long. They are changeable, right? So even Muslim societies have seen different, shifts in different norms over time. And I think the role of religion is overemphasized because there are a lot of Muslim societies, including those in the larger Middle East, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Iran, Tunisia, you find very different patterns. Bangladesh is another country. There are a lot of Muslim societies where religion has not necessarily been a constraint in greater female labor force participation rates. So it seems to me the kind of overemphasized factor. Now coming close to the region, the Middle East, a key aspect is economic structure. You know, if you look around the world, most countries where female labor force participation is higher are typically countries where you have greater dominance of manufacturing sector, right? And these are labor-intensive manufacturing where women can participate. As I argued before, a key feature of the MENA region is greater dependence on oil and oil-linked distributional structures, which can obviously impede greater participation of women in the labor force. But there's another aspect which I think a lot of the work by the Economic Research Forum, particularly Raghi Asad, has highlighted, is the insider-outsider dynamic in labor markets. All across the region, you have a clear insider-outsider dynamic. Either you are inside the public sector, and the public sector is what women really want to work in because of safety and stability. And obviously, the older generations had a better time getting an entry into the state-owned sector, right, in public employment. But young people, particularly young females, are at a disadvantage when it comes to entering their preferred job in the public sector. So that insider-outsider dynamic is crucial. The other aspect which is very important for the region is the role of connections. If you need job, you need connections, right? So the role of wasita is very important. And here again, females are disadvantaged because it's more difficult. Another aspect is mobility and transportation. You know, in Muslim societies, it's extremely important. The safety and reputation for women is very important. It's a question that is particularly important in the context of Egypt, where, you know, how long it takes for women to actually get to the job, come back, you know, who is going to take care of family, those sorts of concerns become quite important. But a change is possible. You talked about the political economy aspect. One reason I believe that is important in the MENA region is the very generous social contract, historically, has meant that populations have been shielded from some of the worst economic shocks. So while, you know, women in Bangladesh, women in Pakistan, women in other places are increasingly, you know, it's no longer a matter of choice that they enter the labor market. They just have to work and come and earn some money in order to make their household needs met. And that is again something now quite visible in the MENA region too. When we talk about female labor force participation rates, there are the middle classes and the upper middle classes, very different problem. When it comes to the lower income classes, including the lower middle classes, it is often not a matter of choice. It's a matter of necessity for women to work. And so if you were to, for example, if the World Bank were to do a survey today in countries that have suffered from a conflict shock, let's say Syria, you would be amazed how many women are working in Syria today. After the war, you know, everybody I know, every family has women who were not working before, they have to work now, just to make ends meet. And of course, also there's a big gap in the public sector because a lot of men have died. And so for them, it's no longer a matter of choice. They really have to work. And it's changed. If you look at female labor force participation, this is my prior, before the war and after the war, in Syria, you would see a massive uptick. I think Saudi Arabia presents a really fascinating counterpoint to that as well, where there's a political shock, right? There's a new political leadership that is trying to break with the past, and it needs to create a new constituency. Now, if you visit Saudi Arabia, a lot of women are working, but you could see a lot of women are working with hijab, and you could sense that a lot of them are actually from the lower middle income groups, right? For them, it's really important to come out and work. Now here, I think politics of reform is very crucial, because a lot of these young women who are now working in the Saudi labor market represent a new political constituency for the regime, because they will be the supporters of reform, and they will ensure that those reforms continue ahead. Now, other areas where Saudi Arabia still needs to make more progress, and there's a lot more work being done, is on how can women be allowed to set up their own enterprises, right? This is a question which is very relevant, particularly in the formal sector. But in the informal sector, if you look at Morocco, for example, much of the smuggling routes are dominated by women working in all of these peripheral areas in Morocco. And again, these are the poorest of the poor. They don't have a choice. They really have to work. So both economic shocks, and I gave you the example of Syria, and political shocks can really change the dynamics on the ground. The idea that this is a time-invariant, unchanging situation that is just linked with the social structure and religion of the place, I think doesn't hold much ground. There's a lot more to explore there.
Thanks. So some hope that, the example of Saudi Arabia can be taken to other countries. And if there is a shock, a political shock or an economic shock, things may change, social norms may change, perception may change, and you set in motion this transition to a different labor market in the economy. Now let me move to Dr. Filmer. One result from the Slido, climate change wasn't coming too prominent as a reason for concern. In reality, climate change is actually very much affecting reality in the labor market in the region. I work, as I said, especially on a country, Morocco, which lost a little bit less than 1 million jobs in the agricultural sector over the last 5 years because of the droughts that became a water stock issue. So a lot of workers, of jobs lost, and not easy to absorb them in the service and manufacturing sector. The policy question that we are facing is, what are we going to do with this? Are we going to invest in active labor market policies, retraining, upskilling, trying to move them, give them the skills to move to the service sector or manufacturing sector? Or do we need to extend social protection? Do we need to extend unemployment benefits? Do we need to strengthen the safety nets, which of course is going to cost money, but for at least for a period of time is going to help transitioning out of this jobs that are going to be lost into new jobs. And this, of course, it's true for climate change. The impact of climate change may also be true for the impact of automation, artificial intelligence in labor markets in this region. So how do you go about? Is there even evidence that active labor market policies, stronger unemployment benefits, social protection, a combination of the two, how would you go about thinking about a policy response to the new reality in the labor markets in the region?
Thanks for the easy question. I mean, the response to the previous question you gave me was about human capital and the centrality of human capital. And I firmly believe that. But obviously, human capital, education, can't do it alone. Ultimately, growth needs to create jobs. I would argue that human capital, foundational human capital, is, I mean, the context of the crisis subtitle of this gathering, I think foundational human capital is what helps countries and individuals ultimately mitigate risks. Jobs are how that human capital gets translated into livelihoods, ultimately. And, to think about the big picture, the combination of that is what helps countries take advantage of opportunities like the demographic dividend, for example. It's really foundational human capital with jobs that ultimately allows countries to really, take advantage of that. That's one of the opportunities as opposed to the risks we've been talking about. I don't want anything I say to be construed as me not being supportive of safety nets and social protection. I think the session prior to the one we're having right now gave a ton of illustrations of just how important social protection programs and safety nets can be. They shield individuals and families from crisis and help avert the worst forms of poverty. They alleviate immediate crises, but actually the evidence often has shown that in many low and middle income countries, safety nets and cash transfers can actually increase, one, productive investments by families themselves, and also, perhaps surprising to economists who focus on, entry-level economics, they can actually increase labor supply as opposed to reduce labor supply in some settings, because they relieve constraints at the level of households and unleash labor supply. But I would argue that these social protection programs are not a substitute for policies that promote the creation of jobs, which is ultimately what's going to support livelihoods. And in support of jobs, you asked about skilling and reskilling. I would say yes, I have no objection to skilling and reskilling programs, and they have shown that they can be successful. But actually, and this relates to the intervention earlier about the low quality of foundational learning, too often reskilling programs are essentially reteaching what should have been taught in school. And often they don't acknowledge themselves as such and are a failure because of it, because they don't actually get to the point of teaching foundational skills. And when we do see things that sometimes they call second chance education, or they go by different names in different places, actually when they acknowledge that they really are about foundational skills, they tend to be more successful. That's just on the reskilling and the skilling. We do see, and the academic debate is rife around, do training programs work? And over again we see that they don't work. But there are successes, and the successful ones tend to focus very much on either, like I was saying before, doing foundational skills and acknowledging themselves as such, or very closely tied to employers and linked to employment opportunities. So it's not hypothetical, it's not theoretical, it's actually, it's training on the job essentially, or as tightly linked to jobs as they can be. But I actually think it comes back to the point that was being discussed by the earlier intervention. Ultimately, is growth going to produce the demand for labor and skills? And I think in the MENA region, too often growth and job creation has been disconnected. And so fundamentally, we need to take a look at what are the policies that lead to informality, exclusion, large public sector. Those become the central, I think, the central element. So I think the answer to the two questions is intimately linked. And so addressing these structural issues, along with building human capital and the sort of catch-up reskilling programs you were asking about, is where the answer lies to that question. Thanks.
Thanks. So, Professor, what is a question for you? We talked about here, again, about the social contract, the importance of getting a new one to change the model of development in the MENA. You mentioned it. I was reading your intervention at the UN General Assembly. We mention it as well. But I've always been struck at what this really means. And especially, how do you go about changing a social contract? And I would add a twist, which is linked to the theme of our meeting here, with the intergenerational inequalities. How do you go about changing a social contract where a big chunk of the population which should be interested in the new social contracts, the youth, and the future generations are most likely not going to be in this reformulation of the social contract? How do you see this? What you have in mind? What do we have in mind concretely when we talk about moving to a new social contract?
Thank you again. You're asking me a question about something I have been thinking about very hard this year. So I will give you the extent to which I think, but there will be things that I'm not also super clear on. So every time I look at a society or a community, I wonder what is the commitment that keeps them in that space? And when you look at the commitment that keeps them in that space, how do you make sure that that commitment is ongoing on a long-term basis? So if you're with your family at a very basic point, right? Somebody is bringing in an income, somebody is doing services in that household, somebody is benefiting but not financially contributing, and then there are more members on the way. And I say it in a very simple way because for me that is the fiscal social contract. But that is an unwritten agreement based on, and I used these words earlier, on love, on kindness, on the willingness to be in the space, because we also know that there are families that don't quite work out the way I am describing it. So it means commitment without necessarily knowing you're going to get something back out of it. So for me, that is the social contract at its very simplistic level. And if you throw this up into a state, into a country, into a region, and then into the world totally, then it's about making sure that we're moving these conversations to all of these levels. But what I see in the world today is while we struggle to have the commitment even at a family level, but in a country, there isn't a similar reflection at regional levels and global levels. There is an absence of this kindness, of this consideration, of this willingness to give without expecting receiving in return. And so for me, when I look at the social contract, for me the new social contract should really be about making sure that this kind of domestic and family level conversation that we have, where we're agreeing and at national level as much as possible, should be the same kind of agreement in what we see as diplomatic or political spaces at a global level. So this is sort of where I come from. And the focus of all of this needs to continue to be the human being. And what I see is an absence of a focus on the human being, and we just talked about climate, on the environment. And the thing is that there are great statistics right now, for example, about if you want to live a lifestyle like those of the countries that have progressed incredibly. If you look at Scandinavian countries, the examples coming out is that if they continue consuming at the level they're consuming, the planet will be completed, I think, 20 times over in 1 year if we all were consuming that same amount. So even when we're looking at these conversations on what a social contract looks like, I think there's a need to move consumption down to a much lower level and allow ourselves to live as close to the ground. And for me, this is where there's a need to have a reflection and a thinking about who's contributing, why they are contributing. And it's already been said by one of the speakers that you have to depoliticize a lot of these conversations because we need to move populations away from survival. But I want to close with just one thing. I have been looking at the life cycle of a child. And I started at 1 year before birth of the child, up to the age of 30. And the reason I looked at this life cycle approach was because it struck me that the same children for whom we are taking on debt and we are building infrastructure will be 25, 30 years later, the ones who have to now pay off the debt. And of course, these are hypotheticals because some debts are paid after 10 or 15 years. But if we lose track of how we protect, we grow, we vaccinate, we ensure that there isn't maternal mortality, that we make sure up to the age of 5 a child is not stunted, that they're getting nutrition, then they don't have mental health issues because they didn't have food when they were growing up. It means that by the time they hit 25 and 30, and they are now part of the social contract, where they are now supposed to be contributing to this economy that we are building, that they will actually be even capable. And for me, the maths right now is not computing because we have countries at war. And these countries, if you project them 20 years later, and you can look at the ones that have emerged out of crisis 20 years ago, that they are not as productive. So that means they cannot pay off debt at the interest rates we are talking about. They're not able to collect taxes at the levels we're projecting. And this, for me, this very human approach is what has been missing so far.
Thanks a lot. Clearly, it is an important objective. And let me close maybe with two questions to Dr. El-Badawi and Dr. Turki about debt. Now, the Slido question was pretty obvious that debt is a slippery slope. Nobody likes it. I mean, probably they're afraid of the use of that. Still, inaction is not possible. Countries in the MENA region needs reforms to close inequalities, to diversify, structural transformation. The risk is to shift the bill to future generations. And it's not obvious to me, and I want to hear your point, that these authorities are really factoring in this kind of intergenerational redistribution when they think about how to use resources. You know, what kind of investment to do, you know, to what extent they're really leaving the bill to pay to future generation. How do you think this is factored in policy making in the region? How would you go about thinking about the intergenerational aspects of fiscal policy, if you want?
Actually, thank you very much, Roberto, but allow me to just very quickly pick on this very moving statement that my colleague Atiyah, Professor Atiyah said about the stunting and the future of children. The head of UNICEF in Khartoum, just after 4 months of this tragic war in Sudan, she declared that there are about 200,000 pregnant women in Khartoum area who do not have access to safe delivery. So I think you could imagine, you know, that actually we have already set the future of these children in a very kind of treacherous and sad path. So let me go back to the question. I would like to start actually to draw the general context again by appealing to a report on a pathway for MENA future development that we at the Economic Research Forum and the Finance for Development Lab of the Paris School of Economics, we did in October 2022 and had the opportunity actually to launch it here in the region as well as part of the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. There are 4 messages which I think are very relevant to the questions and issues you raised. The first message is that the current path leads to financial crisis. However, austerity alone, adjustment without growth will lead to social crisis. The second message is that the IMF programs, including the debt works out, are not sufficient. We need significant recapitalization of the IMF and the MDBs in general in order to resolve this issue of the debt crisis that countries in the region, among other countries, of course, in the developing world, in the global south face. But also, these countries need a national renewal plan, credible enough to ignite growth, not just economic reforms. And I think countries in the region should actually work with other countries in the global south to call for reform of the global financial architecture in a way that will actually provide a space for countries, highly indebted countries in crisis, then so that they can actually work on domestic reform in the medium to longer run. The third message is that there is a considerable growth potential to be had in renewable energy, decarbonization, but economic markets has to be democratized. That actually there is a lot of crony capitalism going around in the region, despite the economic reform. And also, the region also had an opportunity, especially as a result of the global disruptions to supply chains, networks, because of COVID first, and then the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, and more recently the war on Gaza. I think there is a good potential to be had on relocalization and broad regional cooperation. And again, if I could invoke the case of my home country, Sudan. Sudan is very well qualified to become the breadbasket of the region if we are able to put our house in order. It has a tremendous agricultural potential that the region is very much in need for. But right now, it's in a far cry from achieving that goal. The fourth message is that economic reforms are eminently political. So there is need actually to engage the general public and to promote a culture of accountability and transparency on the part of the public sector and the government. The second main point I wanted to mention is that growth strategy is feasible, but it requires significant restructuring of fiscal policy. Right now, in most countries of the region outside the GCC, there are three cost centers that account for most of public outlays. These are debt service. Many countries actually pay more than 20% of the budget of expenditure for servicing debt. The second is subsidies of state-owned enterprises. And many of these state-owned enterprises are not very efficient, and they require significant overhauling. And then the third is commodity subsidies, especially fuel subsidies until recently. There is some significant progress that has been made in terms of reforming subsidies, especially fuel subsidies, but still there is some room for further reform. And the restructuring should go to public investment in order to leverage further investment by the private sector, and also for social protection. The ILO actually did a very interesting study suggesting that the adequate level of social protection in general should be something around 7% of the budget. And actually the region, the Middle East region assigned like about 3.7% among also other developing regions. So there is an important role for fiscal policy. And in this context, even though there is a debate about rule-based macroeconomic institutions such as fiscal rules, but I think, or inflation targeting in terms of monetary policy and exchange rate policy, but these are frontier macroeconomic policies that I think the region lacks. Except for Turkey, there is no country in the region, for example, that adopts, clear inflation targeting or fiscal rules, and these are institutions of accountability and also for inculcating credibility on the part of macroeconomic policy. Finally, I want to close by drawing the implications of the emerging digitech economy, because actually some leading development thinkers now are suggesting that the historical Asian development model is no longer applicable, especially in terms of manufacturing labor-intensive manufacturing. Manufacturing will continue to be a growth escalator, but it is not likely to provide opportunities for large-scale employment. And so, social protections become inseparable from growth strategy. And I think this is another challenge that I think would be important to start to think about for public policy, as well as for those of us who are operating in the research and capacity building, and certainly, obviously, development institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and partners of development. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And maybe so the last question to Dr. Turki Balala. So Saudi Arabia again is a different case. It doesn't have debt, it has net wealth. So the choice for Saudi Arabia is different. It's not how much to spend now and what's the bill to leave to future generation, but how much to spend now, how much to save for future generation. How does your country see that trade-off, and how, again, your fiscal policy reflects this intergenerational redistribution of your wealth in the way you think about running things today?
Okay. Let me put things into perspective and into the context of our forum and topic today. It's important to recognize that when we look at our region, that countries are in different, stage of development, structure of economy, and even political stability. And we are all saddened by what is happening in Sudan and Palestine, and we pray to Allah to bring an end to these sufferings, and we see prosperity going forward. So the policy priorities are different, and how to deal with debt and current spending versus future generation. For the case of Saudi Arabia, and here let me rephrase the question, how we manage our spending needs today, including investing in diversification, while not losing sight of the intergenerational redistribution of wealth. And how we go about this is and we actually have greatly invested in strengthening public finances. So just to make sure that the natural resources become a source of strength and resilience rather than source of volatility and uncertainty. So one of the main vision realization program is about fiscal sustainability, to ensure stability in the short term, while also making sure that sustainability for the longer term. And we have a robust fiscal framework where we continuously work on improving revenue collection, increasing spending efficiency, and focusing on debt management. So to make sure that debt remains within certain ratios while the economy is growing. So the future generation will have less burden when it comes to debt issue. So that's on the fiscal side. On the net wealth of Saudi Arabia as a whole, we have a main tool, which is the Public Investment Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi Arabia. In 2015, the assets under management was around $150 billion. The target was for 2025 to reach 1 trillion. Today we are in 2024, we are almost there, 920 billion. And by 2030 we are working to reach 2 trillion US dollar. So future generation, we will have this huge assets under the management of well-sophisticated, framework under the management of His Excellency, His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his team. So the assets that under management here also have its own strategy, investing abroad, but at the same time investing domestically, carefully investing domestically, also not crowding out the private sector. So the PIF invests in strategic sectors. And usually these strategic sectors have very high risk and requires patient finance. So these sectors are, although strategic, but are not attracted to the private sector. So we cannot really rely on the market economy or invisible hand to come in and flow investment in these sectors. So the PIF will come in and invest until the sector is mature and bankable, profitable, so they will sell it to the public. So they will make more money, and it's mutually beneficial for everyone. So they exit the sector and then look for another strategic sector. And by doing so, we ensure that future generation will have the wealth. And now we have invested adequately in what we need to invest in diversification. On the other hand, we have also the National Development Fund, which is overseeing many development funds and banks. And the strategy for these funds is to enable the private sector, including SMEs in agriculture, in tourism, to enable the private sector to participate more effectively in the economic activities. And they have to align their strategies and plans with Vision 2030. And here I want to reiterate my point that I mentioned in my previous intervention, that the vision is comprehensive, covering all sectors. So, and all entities within the public sector has to align their plans and strategies with the overarching strategy of Vision 2030. So we have alignment and synergies between all sectors within the economy. So this National Development Fund will make sure that we enable the private sector to achieve, help us achieve Vision 2030. And this model that we are working within helps us to strike the right balance when it comes to trade-off between current spending and future spending. Moreover here, this model is not enough to be successful in achieving what you want. You have to have the right ecosystem, which we are working on within Vision 2030. So you need to have the right legal and regulatory framework for this model to be successful. You have to have a well-developed and liquid capital market, which we are working on. We have it already. There is also another program in the Vision 2030 which focus on developing the financial sector, including a capital market. Prudent fiscal policy is also important to make sure that we don't add more burden on our net wealth, and we have a dedicated program to ensure fiscal prudency when it comes to fiscal policies. And we have both the model and the ecosystem to achieve this trade-off.
Thanks a lot. So this concludes our session. We're not expecting or hoping to find solutions to problems, but I guess one theme that comes strongly from the session is the importance of building the consensus, and I'll say incentive-compatible reforms, bringing the interest of all parties aligned for a change in the political economy context of the reforms in the region, from the private sector development, even education reforms, and the need to put all actors into the same, to align across the same dimensions, and the importance of visions and political commitment, but also capacity. The idea of building institutions which are agile and can react to changes, can kind of steer the process of transformation in the direction that it needs to take if things change. There's of course very difficult things to do, but we are comforted by the fact that there's some countries in the region, through, like Saudi Arabia, through starting from of course the very important net wealth that it has, that are moving in the right directions, and there is some evidence that social norms can change, if the right shocks occur and the right policies are implemented when the shock occurs. So there is hope that when we're going to meet again in 20 years, we're going to change the premise of this meeting and say that important progress have been made in closing the gaps in the region. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. Thank you all.
نشكر الزملاء في IMF على هذه الجلسة الدسمة، وننتقل الآن إلى الجلسة الأخيرة في هذا المنتدى، وهي بعنوان التضامن والتنسيق. وستيسر لنا هذه الجلسة السيدة لميا المبيض بساط، نائب رئيس لجنة خبراء الإدارة العامة التابعة للأمم